Yeah, there you go. As I say, all opinion. Can't sue me for defamation if I'm just voicing my opinion. That freedom has not been taken from me yet. G'day, welcome back to the channel. We're in lockdown in New Zealand, as you all know, and most people realise that I'm pretty anti-authority, well, anti-rules, anti-bureaucracy, anti-government. People think this is the case with me because, you know, I have come out very strongly against many of the drone rules that have been forced upon us by regulators around the world, and I often criticise politicians for their stupidity because it's such a common thing. But it might surprise you to know my thoughts on the lockdowns here in New Zealand. Now, I've just watched Lewis Rossman. He's done a really good video looking at it from the outside. He's not in New Zealand or Australia, but he's made comments on the lockdown in Australia and the way it's taking people's rights and freedoms. It doesn't seem very constitutional. Well, I don't think they have a constitution in Australia. It doesn't seem the right thing to do. People have a right to freedoms. They have a right to privacy. They have so many rights. And these rights seem to have been taken from them in countries like Australia and New Zealand, where if I go down to get some supermarket shopping, if I go anywhere, I've got to take my smartphone, and I've got a little app on here which scans a QR code. It's outside every business. It's a mandatory requirement now. And that code, or that app, then reports back to a central computer operated by Big Brother, who then knows where I was and at what time I was there. The rationale for that being that, well, if there was anyone else there who had COVID, I need to get tested because I may have been exposed to that virus. So you would think, in light of my position on such things, I would be outraged by this lockdown. I would be screaming and saying, we've got to have our freedoms back. I want my freedoms. That's not the case. It's going to surprise a lot of people to know that I fully support this lockdown. I think it's a fantastic thing, even though I don't have the right to leave my home except for obtaining food, medical treatment, or for some exercise in my local area, which generally means walking around the block. That's about it. Why am I not outraged? Why am I not screaming from the rooftops and demanding my freedoms back? Well, it's pretty simple, really. I've done the research. And it's one thing to do, to remove a freedom with no justification, like, you know, as is happening with our drone rules. I mean, some of the things that freedoms are taking away from us are ridiculous, and they haven't presented a justification. There's been no risk analysis. There's been no evidence to back it up. And in fact, all the evidence we have says that drones are the safest form of aviation that has ever been and ever will be, but we're getting more and more rules and freedoms withdrawn. So that's why I rebel against that, because these are bad rules, these are bad restrictions, these are bad regulations. But lockdown, when you look at the results of previous operations and what it's doing, it's actually a good thing. I'll tell you why it's a good thing. Because when COVID first came to New Zealand back in March of last year, we had a lockdown, and it was a very, very sharp lockdown. And same as today, we couldn't leave our houses, we couldn't do virtually anything, and it worked. Within a few months, we had eradicated COVID from our community. No community transmission of COVID at all. So while the rest of the world was still suffering with the effects of this virus, we went about business as usual. We went to the beach, we had parties, we went to the movies, went out flying without masks or social distancing, all those things. We just got on life as usual. There was no COVID in New Zealand. Australians did something similar, and theirs worked pretty well as well. So we were a couple of nations in the South Pacific Ocean enjoying life without COVID. And what's not to like about that? I mean, COVID has been the risks of COVID have been somewhat overstated by, in a lot of cases. You know, if you catch COVID, chances are you're not going to die, right? I mean, the death rate is, depending on what figures you look at, anywhere from 1.5% to 2%. So you got one chance in somewhere between 75 and 50 of dying if you catch COVID. Those are pretty good odds. Those are pretty good odds. Much better than playing Russian roulette with the 6 holes and 1 bullet in the chamber. So it's understandable why some people think this is an outrageous imposition. But the reality is, if you happen to be, or one of your friends or one of your family members happen to be the unfortunate 1.5 or 2 people in 100, it's a whole different story. Nobody wants to lose a friend. No one wants to lose a relative unnecessarily. And I say unnecessarily because here in New Zealand, for almost 12 months, not a single death associated with COVID. Pretty damn good if you ask me. That's worth paying for. And we didn't have to pay with much or for very long. As I say, we were locked down very hard for, I think it was about 6 weeks, 6 weeks in total. And then we had a year of total freedom. Freedoms that people overseas in more freedom-oriented countries just didn't get. You know, there were countries where, look at the UK, they didn't go short and hard, and they were effectively locked down and restricted from many things for months and months, and the best part of a year they couldn't do stuff until Freedom Day. Whereas in New Zealand, we were happy to not forsake, but we were happy to shelve our freedoms for a few weeks so we could then enjoy them again, unfettered, for an entire year. That's a pretty damn good deal if you ask me, because the cost or the benefits from just setting aside your freedoms for a few weeks were enormous. The New Zealand economy has gone from strength to strength. Only one section has been really badly impacted, that's the tourism industry. But everybody else, we've got more jobs, more people in employment now than before COVID started. We've got less unemployment than before COVID started. It's been fantastic from every aspect. People have been healthier because due to the effects of our initial lockdown, we didn't even have much in the way of flu over the winter. It was just brilliant. And so everyone's really happy. But of course, as we all know, you can't trust politicians to do anything properly. They got it right the first time. And then, wouldn't you know it, I don't know what you call it, narcissism or something, but they decided we've done so well, we don't have to do anything else. And while the rest of the world was being vaccinated, New Zealand wasn't. We were this little South Pacific island and subtropical South Pacific island nation, no COVID, so why would we need vaccines? Oh, no, we don't need vaccines, we've got no COVID. Anyone with half a brain, which probably that means about 10 politicians all put together, half a brain, would have realised that we really do need to vaccinate the population, because our strategy at the moment, first of all, it's not 100% bulletproof. There's always the risk that something will get through the border and put COVID into the community. And eventually we're going to have to open our borders up anyway so that people can come and go. Or, we have to write off our second largest industry, which is the tourism industry, which is almost wholly reliant on international overseas visitors coming to New Zealand and spending all their money here. That's the second largest business in the country, second largest industry in the country. So it's very important. It was very important, not so important now. So we needed to get a vaccination campaign underway, but we didn't. We didn't start vaccinating people in earnest until a few months ago. We had a year sitting on our fat bottoms doing nothing. The government just, oh, we're so clever. Aren't we kind? Aren't we wonderful? Pat ourselves on the back. No. I don't know. As I say, it takes 10 politicians to make half a brain, and that was so much proven. And if you need more proof than that, here we were up until a couple of months ago, happy in our isolation, doing well. Everyone had food on the table, and one of the mildest winters on record, fantastic. And we had a great summer in the South Pacific Island holiday retreat that is us. We were just in paradise. I mean, look at these curtains. Where else would you find curtains like that? That just says it all. It's such a wonderful place to be in this country. Even the curtains are happy. So there we were, and then of course we had this problem. The biggest problem we've got is our tourism industry. As I say, second largest industry in the country, and it has kept a small number of people very, very well, what would you say, supplied. There are a few people in the industry that make a lot of money. I mean, the average worker in the tourism industry doesn't earn much money. It's a lot of minimum wage workers in the service industries associated with tourism. They get just whatever, $14 or $15 an hour. That's all they get here for doing that stuff. So they're not making a lot of money out of tourism. But the people who own the businesses, they make a lot of money. It's like which Ferrari will I drive today? Or the Lambo, or the I don't know, but that's what sort of happens. The money floats to the top. Those people, very, very upset with our government because they closed the borders, and overseas tourists couldn't come into this country, so they weren't able to get the Ferrari serviced on time, at least not both of them, just one of them they could afford a service for. And so they went to the government and said, look, you've got to help us because we are out of business. There's no overseas tourists. What are we going to do? And the government, being the bunch of dullards that they are, said, well, we'll just give you some money. So they gave them hundreds of millions of dollars for sitting on their fat bottoms and doing nothing except going, oh, there's no overseas tourists, what will we do? So they paid them to do nothing. That's never a good thing to do. So they burned through that money, and then they came back and said, we still don't have any overseas tourists. What are we going to do? And they said, because Australia, next door, 1,500 miles away, because they were sitting there and they were also COVID-free, the tourism industry in New Zealand came up with this brilliant idea. Oh, why don't we open a travel bubble with Australia? Why don't we allow Australians to come into New Zealand without having to go through that 14-day quarantine that's protecting us from the COVID, because they don't have COVID in Australia. We don't need that quarantine period. And of course the government said, yeah, it sounds like a good idea because we're thicker than two short planks. Let's do it. I wrote a blog. When they announced they were going to do this, I wrote a blog I have a daily blog, been running since 1995. It's probably the longest running blog on the internet. It was started before blogging was even a thing. And I said, this is utter folly. It's ludicrous to extend the risk, to massively increase the risk that we face from COVID by having an open border with another country over which we have no control. But the lobbyists for the tourism industry, who were so concerned that the people at the top of the tourist industry were not going to be able to buy the new Lamborghini Countach because there was not enough money, I don't know, this is an opinion, right? I've got to be careful because you don't want to get sued for defamation. This is an opinion. I tend to think that, and just looking at what's happened in the past, rich lobbyists go to some of these politicians and say, you look after us and we'll look after you. Because the number of New Zealand prime ministers that have left the position of political leader and then got appointed to sort of honorary positions on the boards of large corporations and companies. And I say honorary positions because they get paid a snot load of money for doing virtually nothing. I think that's the payback from them being looked after while they're in power. It's just an opinion, but I think that's what happens. So I don't know what inducements the tourism industry may or may not have offered our politicians as individuals rather than as representatives of the people, but the stupid rock and a sock politicians came out and said, yeah, let's do it. Let's open the borders with Australia. And as I said, this is folly. This is just going to end in disaster. Now, the rationale for this was that by opening the borders with Australia, the New Zealand tourism industry would get much needed tourists from Australia who would then spend their money in this country and keep that industry alive. And I pointed out that, well, there's a few $100 million they're going to get from the Australians coming in. It's not a lot of money. It's only Australia. And it only takes one person coming in from Australia with COVID to completely shut down the tourism industry again for however long. In fact, to shut the whole damn country down with a lockdown. And I was assured, no, we've got everything's in place. All the borders will still work because Australia's got its own border protection. There will never be COVID coming this way. Anyway, so a few weeks, a month or two after the travel bubble with Australia was opened, we ended up with a Delta variant of COVID in the community because someone coming from Australia and not having to go through the border, the normal isolation and quarantine, came straight into New Zealand and started spreading the virus. Now, previously COVID-free country, despite the assurances that government had given us, despite the fact I'd said, this is stupid, this is ridiculous, exactly what happened. Now, I'm not a prophet, I'm just a layman, but I could see this. I'm used to analysing situations, looking at risk reward, doing the calculations, the risk assessment, you might say. And in this case, the risk assessment said, do not do this. But the government did it anyway. Now, I do a risk assessment with my drone, and I can say, this is 100% safe. And the rules say, you may not do that. You may not fly FPV without a spotter, even though you've only got this tiny little drone. It's against the rules. I know it's 100% safe, but the government says no. And then when I say to the government, this is so risky, it should never even be contemplated, they say, no, it's fine. And the worst happens. So that's my beef at government. They just don't listen. They're just so stupid and selfish. And when I say selfish, I mean as individuals. It's not the government, it's the politicians themselves looking out for what's best for them. I honestly believe, they're looking out for their post-political careers, where they can get jobs appointed perhaps on these tourism companies and get a nice little kickback for doing nothing except looking after them while they're in a position to do so. Yeah, there you go. As I say, all opinion. Can't sue me for defamation if I'm just voicing my opinion. That freedom has not been taken from me yet. So now we find ourselves back in lockdown, and the stupidity, as I said, I warned that the economics of it didn't add up. You're going to get a few $100 million, but you're going to risk billions, and that's what's happened. We've now been in lockdown for about 3 weeks, and it's costing, the government has admitted it's costing over $1 billion a week in wage subsidies during this lockdown. $1 billion a week. So the tourism industry got a few $100 million, and taxpayers are paying out over $3 billion so far. Really, why don't we just, well, no, we shouldn't have given them the money, but it shows you the folly. It is complete economic suicide to even contemplate these things. Now, my message to the tourism industry in this is get a job. Get a job. Now, there are industries that come and go. You know, every industry has its time, and then eventually there's no room for that. Now, when people rode horses and had carriages, horse-drawn carriages, buggy whips were big. They were a major industry. You could have a buggy whip, so you could give your horse a bit of a tap on the side, tell it to go fast or whatever. So the buggy whip industry was quite prosperous, employed a lot of people, sold a lot of product. And then the horseless carriage came along, the motor vehicle, the car. And suddenly there wasn't such a demand for buggy whips anymore. So what happened? Well, the buggy whips makers went out of business, or they diversified, did something else. And that's what's happening with tourism. That's what should happen with tourism. Experts have said that international tourism will not return to normal levels for quite a few years to come because of the COVID. So the tourism industry should appreciate this and say, well, we're no longer a viable industry. There is no viable international tourism in this country. We need to find something else to do. We need to start a new business or to do something, but we can't expect the New Zealand taxpayer to either hand us over hundreds of millions of dollars or to take unreasonable risks by simply opening the doors so that we can get a few dollars in our pockets. No. The tourism industry in New Zealand needs to radically reform itself in light of the changing conditions, or just shut up shop. Because, to be honest, a lot of the New Zealand tourist operations are so expensive that locals can't afford them. We've got Hobbiton down the road, you know, the Lord of the Rings. Hobbiton, $80 to go to Hobbiton. $80 in New Zealand. That is from minimum wage. That's over a day. It was nearly a day's wages just to go to Hobbiton. It's ridiculous. It's silly. So my word to the tourism industry is stop endangering the rest of the country by demanding unreasonable privileges over other industries, and just go and find a job. Go and get a job. It doesn't matter. Sell the Lamborghini, keep the Ferrari, but go and get a job. Anyway, but now we've got to look at the future. What does this country, New Zealand, do from now on? We're in lockdown. We've shelved our freedoms temporarily because we know that the lockdown works. And in fact, looking at the figures today, we're down to 20 community cases today from a high of about 80. So our R number is quite low and it's dropping all the time. I expect pretty soon we won't have any more community cases, in which case, woohoo, we have stopped the community spread of the virus. Give it a couple of extra weeks just to allow for, a few undetected cases. Then we can release these lockdowns. We can go back to the freedom of living in a nation where there is no COVID in the community. We can have our parties and go to the beach and go flying and all those things that we've temporarily set aside in order to achieve a goal. So I'm happy with that. I've got no complaints. I'm happy to invest my freedoms now to recover them with interest later. Because while the rest of the world is still dealing with the third wave of COVID, with our lockdowns, it'll be gone. We won't have to deal with a third wave because there'll be no COVID. Fantastic. We will have our freedoms back with interest. You guys will still be facing all the restrictions that COVID in the community produces. It's a win for us. So that's why I'm not jumping up and down screaming from the rooftop saying, I want my freedoms back, because I know I'm going to get them back. And if I don't, there will be trouble. But where does New Zealand go from here? Well, as I mentioned, we are a beautiful island nation in the subtropical area of the South Pacific. There's not a lot to not like about living here. I believe we should keep our borders closed. Keep them closed at least for another 6 months, maybe longer. Because if we've eradicated COVID from our shores, we can get our vaccination program completed, get more people vaccinated, so that if there is a breakthrough case, well, we can deal with it more readily. It's not going to be so many people endangered. But more importantly, the virus is mutating at quite an alarming rate at the moment. We've seen the Delta strain, which has been far more infectious and has resulted in the third wave all over the world, despite vaccination. Israel has one of the most highly vaccinated nations in the world, and at the moment it has the highest new infection rate per capita of any nation in the world. The vaccine is not stopping people from getting COVID. It's reducing the effects of the COVID, but people are still dying and people are still getting long COVID, even though they're vaccinated. So it's not a silver bullet. And what's happening is the virus is evolving to sidestep the vaccination. It'll continue to do so. We've got now the Lambda strain, which looks like it's even more resistant to the effects of vaccination. And I've read this morning of another one, I can't remember the name of the variation, but there is another strain which looks to be almost entirely unaffected by vaccination. That's a worry. That's a worry, because if one of those strains gets out there and it's more infectious and it has more dangerous, if it kills people more readily, the whole thing kicks off again. And all the vaccinations we've got, useless, don't do a damn thing. So I think New Zealand should keep its borders closed and should vaccinate up its population. And then before they reopen the borders, perhaps, I don't know, around about February or March of next year, as our summer is coming to an end, we should look at what the latest vaccine is to deal with the newest variants to give ourselves a booster shot. And then, if we need to, we can open our borders. In the meantime, the international tourism industry, well, they can be washing cars and picking up bottles and cleaning windows, whatever they need to do to survive. Don't come running to me to keep you in the style to which you've become accustomed. Maybe they'll start a new industry, which will be even better for them and us. So that's where we're at. I don't mind investing my freedoms for a few weeks to gain a long-term advantage. I am anti-regulatory overreach, but I don't think this is overreach. I'm anti-authoritarian governments, but I don't think this is authoritarianism for the wrong reasons. There is a definite goal, and even though our politicians are as thick as a sack of rocks, they're trying to do the right thing. So there you go. Let's hope they've learned their lesson about the dangers of bowing to political lobbyists. And those who did need to be kicked out right now. There's no room for them in Parliament, in our government. If they're going to just take whatever inducements are offered to them and endanger the lives of 5 million people, there's no place for them in government. They need to go. They need to go now. But that's it. That is my little rant about the lockdown in New Zealand. It's not as bad as you think. Who would not want to be locked down in one of the most beautiful countries in the world with Netflix, potato chips, beer, beautiful curtains, lovely weather, and get paid for it, which is exactly what's happening here. I'm not getting paid. I've still got to work. You only get paid if your employer's got a 40% loss of revenue. I've just worked harder to try and make more videos to get my revenues up. I don't think I should be getting $1 from anybody except those people who see value in what I do. I've never had a dollar handout from the taxpayer. I don't expect I ever will. I qualify in New Zealand for the pension, but I don't uplift it because as long as I can pay my bills myself, I would rather that money went to people who need it more than me. I am not a socialist, but I'm not a hardcore capitalist. I'm just a pragmatic person that sits in the middle and decides every case on its merits after doing my research. Thanks for watching, guys. Do the comments with your comedy bits. I'm sure I've pissed a lot of people off. Oh, you should be outraged. You should be marching in the streets. But I don't know. Just tell me what you think. What would you be doing in my position? If you were locked down like me, would you be upset? Or would you be happy that there was an opportunity to get rid of COVID, get back to normal in just a few short weeks? Food for thought. Bye for now.